Hi everyone, this is Mark Marshall with Anatomy of Tone. Today I want to talk about using neighbor tones to connect chord tones as a form of building runs or just coloring the shift from a third. Right, this could work for a minor or a major third. Before we get started, please hit the subscribe button. That way you'll be able to see future releases of my videos on similar topics that I think you'll be interested in as they come out. I also have a podcast called Anatomy of Tone, which you could find on all podcast outlets, and my website is anatomyofguitartone.com. What is a neighbor tone? You may have not heard this term before. A neighbor tone means a note that is right next to a note that we're playing. So if we're playing a C note, its neighbors would either be B or D, because that's one step away in either direction. So they're called neighbor tones. In these examples for guitar, I'm going to focus on using these neighbor tones as a means to move up or down a third, trying to build this around the idea of we're often targeting chord tones when we're soloing over a chord. And for this example, I'm just going to focus on basic triads. We're not going to worry about dominant chords or ninth or 11th chords too much yet, but we'll start with a simple triad. Often our target tones are either going to be the root third or the fifth of that chord. They're the best starting and ending points for our musical sentences. How we navigate between each of those poles or those target tones can vary, right? We can have different ways of coloring it depending on the distance that we will travel. And this is what a lot of people confuse when it comes to the idea of runs. They learn just how to move from position A to position B very quickly, but they're not thinking a lot about how they're maneuvering around the target tones or the chord tones that they want to focus on. And I think that is an issue for people because later on they're just playing runs from rote memorization rather than being able to apply them in more musical manners. So I'm trying to focus on using them in a more musical manner. Rhythm comes into play when we're going to talk about using neighbor tones in order to move between thirds. So I'm using neighbor tones to enable us to use 4 notes before we hit our next target tone, which is a third up. So in other words, if I have a C note and I want to get to E, I'm going to play C, B, C, D, E. Right? So those 4 notes could be 8th notes, they could be 16th notes. It basically gives us a 4-note pattern before we hit the next chord tone. Hitting chord tones on a beat tends to be very important. It's not to say you can't anticipate a chord tone or that they always have to be on the beat, period. But we should learn as we're developing our guitar soloing techniques, improvisation techniques, composition techniques, the value of landing on a chord tone on a beat, and actually what the strong beats are in music, and those beats are 1 and 3. So we often like to have consonants or resolution on beats 1 and 3, and 2 and 4 can be different levels of dissonance, often connecting those consonants. That's another topic to get into, but just laying this out so you know this exists for the future. So I chose the 4-note neighbor tone option as a way to have 4 notes that could be used as 4 16th notes or 4 8th notes before we land on our third. So again, it works from a major third up, going upwards, and going down a major third. There are a couple hitches using this method. You're going to find that moving from the 7th degree of the scale to the root is not a third, so we're not really going to be able to use our neighbor tone pattern to transition from the 7th note to the octave of the scale. In an upwards motion, we can use it between the root and the third and the fifth and the 7th if we are playing some type of 7th chord, and then that's it, right? Unless we want to start using tensions like the 9th, 11th, and 13th, because they will continue on in thirds. We're not there yet. We're not talking about that yet. So right now we're sticking with triads. We're just starting to touch on 7th chords, whether they're major or dominant. Okay, now going downwards, the position it doesn't work the best is from the root down to the first interval, which would make it a 6. So if we're in C and I go down a third, it's going to be some sort of A note, which isn't a chord tone. Now technically the 6th is consonant over our C chord, but we're really trying to just focus on the neighbor tone landing to a chord tone. I wouldn't use the root down method for this, but I would start going down from the 5th. So the 5th down to 3rd lands us to the 3rd of chord, E. So G is the 5th of C, I take it down a third, that gives us an E. Let's look at some of the examples I have in Dorico right now. Example 1, you're going to see that I move up a third from C to E. I'm envisioning here that I'm playing over a C chord, and I wanted to move between the C and E pitches, which is the root and the third. So I used the neighbor tone philosophy. I went C, B, C, D, E. And you'll notice that that D is a passing tone because it really is just there in order to get to C to E. But that B note is the neighbor tone. It's adjacent to the C note, and we're hitting it so that it gives us more time, it prolongs the phrase, so it gives us more time to move to the E note. Example 2, you see the first two notes, the E and C, which is our frame, is I'm going down a third. Now, I used a neighbor tone, but in the opposite direction of example 1. I went E, F, E, D, C. You'll see the F is the neighbor tone, and the D is the passing tone. In the third example, I decided to move the distance of a fifth and connect two neighbor tone phrases together in order to get there. We started on C, we ended on G, and at the end of the phrase, you can see our framework, right? Fifth as a frame. I know I want to move that distance, but I want to color it. I want to give it a little more ornamentation in order to get there instead of just only playing those two notes. We created a neighbor tone run. You'll see I did the same pattern, just transposed. So it's C, B, C, D, E, D, E, F, and then G is our landing pitch. This is a nice way to be able to string a couple of these together in order to get to the distance of, like, say, a fifth. But just remember, you have to be mindful because moving down a third from the root isn't going to work for landing on a chord tone, and moving from the seventh up to the root isn't going to work with this method to land on a chord tone. Right here, we're going to see that I'm moving upwards, and I'm using each note of the chord as a point of departure and using the neighbor tone philosophy. The neighbor tone goes down and then up again, starting from the root, the third, and the fifth. As I mentioned earlier, the fifth sets us up to land on the seventh of the chord, so you have to be mindful of that chord if you want to imply it being dominant or a major seventh. In this next example, I went down in thirds, and this here I demonstrated in the first bar that if we go down a third, we end up on the sixth, which again isn't a dissonant tone, but I'm trying to just focus on simple triadic chord tones for this example, just to get it under your fingers and in your mind. All right, for the next example, I wanted to think about using it over some chord changes. I wrote down frame of melodic targets. What I mean is that I have the chords C major 7, D minor 7, G7, C major 7. It's a 1, 2, 5, 1 progression. I want to just navigate through these chord changes using neighbor tones. I first had the framework, so I picked out the pitches that I wanted to play for each chord. I didn't start with neighbor tones, right? Because I'm using them to fill in the blanks. I'm using them to color. So it started with what notes I wanted to play in a phrase, and from there, I'm going to figure out how to ornament them and what I'm going to be able to use maneuver-wise to navigate between them. Once I had the framework, I went in and filled them out using the neighbor tones. And in this instance, you'll see all the neighbor tones. They go in an upward motion, but I labeled them out here. The C major 7, I start on the third of the chord. The D minor 7, I start on the flat seventh of the chord. The G7, I start on the major third of the chord, and I just did a 5-1 resolution over the C major 7. I did the same thing over the, you see, I used the same chord progression for the next example, 2-5-1. I didn't start off with the one chord. I started with a framework, which is a little busier. I have a little more motion in this one with a downward and an upward and a downward motion, so thinking a little bit more about the shape and the arc of this movement. And then I started to fill it in using the neighbor tones, and I marked them NT, and you can see I go up and down in this one. So we have a little bit more variety in here, so it feels like there's more movement. I'm going to switch to guitar now, and I'm going to work through and demonstrate these examples. Here's example 1. I'm going to move from C to E. This is the distance I want to move. In order to get there, I went. Now to get down to that note, so upwards, and then downwards. I'm going to move up a fifth now. You've heard this stuff all over classical music, but it's also in all other genres of music as well. Here we go. We just traveled the distance of a fifth. I'm going to maneuver from each of the chord tones. I'm going to start from the root. I'm going to start from the third. I'm going to start from the fifth. Okay, we're out of almost over a major seventh chord. That would sound nice, right? Let's descend. C down to A. Right, now that's the one I said that's problematic because that's not really in our C chord. Now I'm saying it's not dissonant, right? But we don't really want to use that, so I'm actually going to start from the seventh of the chord, which is B. Right, so now I'm going to start from the fifth. Then from the third. What position you play this in can vary depending on where you're traveling to. Something you always have to remember about guitar. It's a little confusing when it comes to deciding what fingerings we're going to use for something. Okay, now I looked at the frames. So the frame for this melodic targets, which I mentioned, the 1, 2, 5, 1, was. And I played over the 1, 2, 5, 1, I played chords behind it would have been the C major 7, D minor 7, G7, back to C major 7. Now, this doesn't just apply to jazzy chords or classical music. You can use this as a means over rock and pop music as well. Just avoid maybe starting and ending from the sevenths, because the sevenths are going to imply a slightly different texture and color than is in most pop music these days. The next example, let's talk about the framework. So we have an F, a D, a B, an E, and a C. All right, so F, D, B, E, C. Let's look at the way I snaked through the 2-5-1 progression. You may wonder why I'm not just blazing through these to show you. I think practicing really, really slow is super important. Don't worry about how fast you can shred yet. You're actually going to be able to play faster if you approach it very slowly right from the beginning. There's more power in practicing slow than there is at full speed. I hope this gave you some great ideas about what neighbor tones are and how to use them, incorporate them in runs and ornamentations to move through intervals and chord tones while you're improvising, soloing, or composing. If you're interested in learning more and getting deeper into music theory, guitar technique, compositional techniques, reach out to me at anatomyofguitartone.com. I do offer private one-to-one lessons where I could help show you some tips that would save you a lot of time and frustration. Where I also talk about guitar pedals, guitar amplifiers, everything that influences tone. This includes electric and acoustic guitar instruments. Hope everyone has a great week.